The first week of June 1944 carries a well-known place in the historical record, yet hidden beneath the familiar narrative lies a question almost never asked. What if the first Allied boots to hit the beaches of Normandy were not American or British, but Soviet? In the early hours of June 5, as storm clouds roll over the English Channel, an operation long buried in the margins of declassified Soviet archives offers a glimpse into a startling alternative path the war might have taken. It begins with a rumor, circulated among British intelligence officers at Bletchley Park, of unusual Soviet naval movements in the Baltic and murky radio traffic suggesting the existence of an unauthorized amphibious plan. The challenge facing the Allies is already immense. Operation Overlord depends on coordination among dozens of divisions, thousands of aircraft, and a fragile chain of secrecy. But for the Soviet High Command, the struggle is different. Joseph Stalin, wary of Western ambitions in post-war Europe, authorizes a special landing group drawn from the 5th Guards Army and reinforced by Baltic Fleet Marine brigades. Their directive is unusually concise: secure a foothold on the French coast to ensure Soviet participation in the shaping of the Western Front. There is no mention of coordination with the Western Allies. By the night of June 5, their small convoy, disguised among merchant vessels, is moving south at speed. While British and American planners finalize their final weather assessments in Portsmouth, the Soviets are already nearing the Cotentin Peninsula. Their approach is masked by the same storms that delay the official Allied landings. Yet witnesses along the Channel Islands recall dim silhouettes on the horizon, silhouettes that do not match German patrol boats. A British RAF meteorological pilot notes unidentified craft operating dangerously close to controlled maritime zones. But the report is filed too late to matter. The first Soviet landing craft begin lowering into the violent surf around 3:10 on June 6. The Soviet troops who hit the beaches near Ouistreham face a brutal mix of wind, rain, and German machine gun nests. These are not the sweeping Normandy beaches chosen by Allied planners. They are narrower, cluttered with seawalls, and patrolled by elements of the German 716th Infantry Division. What gives the Soviets a brief advantage is surprise. German defenses, conditioned to watch the horizon for waves of American and British craft, are unprepared for a scattered force of marine infantry storming ashore under the cover of the storm. According to a later account attributed to a Baltic Fleet officer, the Germans did not expect us. The sea was our greatest enemy, and perhaps our only ally. Yet confusion spreads as quickly as the Soviet troops themselves. At 5:45, the British 3rd Infantry Division, preparing for its own landing schedule, intercepts fragments of radio chatter in Russian from the Normandy sector. Colonel David Christie of British Naval Intelligence later writes, "There was no plausible explanation at the time. Either the Germans were mimicking Russian transmissions, or someone had begun the invasion without telling us." Allied planners struggle to reconcile the possibility. A Soviet landing is politically unthinkable, yet the evidence suggests otherwise. Historical diaries from German officers of the 21st Panzer Division offer further clarity. One major records seeing troops in unfamiliar helmets and carrying submachine guns of a type not used by the English, advancing inland near the Orne River. What he describes matches the PPSH-41, a signature Soviet weapon. His confusion mirrors the unease rippling through German and Allied lines alike. By midday, the Soviets pushed toward Cannes, moving with a sense of urgency. Their orders, reconstructed from post-war documents, emphasize speed over consolidation. They must secure strategic crossroads before either the Germans counterattack or the Western Allies arrive in force. This haste creates a dangerous tactical vacuum. Soviet units advance too quickly, leaving scattered pockets of resistance behind them. These pockets, when combined with the increasingly chaotic communications environment, lead to gaps neither the Allies nor the Soviets fully understand. One British intelligence note from the morning of June 6 carries a telling remark: "We have found ourselves chasing shadows, Soviet shadows, on a day we believed belonged solely to the Western Alliance." The remark underscores the growing sense of uncertainty. What exactly is the Soviet objective? Is this meant as cooperation or competition? The modern lesson, in hindsight, becomes clear. Even among allies, wartime objectives rarely align perfectly. The race to open a second front has always been presented as a shared mission. But this scenario highlights how quickly shared interests can diverge under the pressure of victory and the anticipation of post-war influence. As night falls on June 6, the Soviets hold scattered beachheads east of Sword Beach, but their situation remains precarious. They are outnumbered, low on ammunition, and operating without the complex logistical framework the Western Allies have spent months preparing. Yet they press on, knowing that each hour they maintain a presence on French soil shifts the post-war chessboard ever so slightly. And across the Channel, in the dimly lit rooms of Allied command centers, the question grows louder. If the Soviets have taken the first steps onto the beaches of Normandy, what comes next? At dawn on June 7, 1944, the coast of Normandy reveals a landscape no Allied planner ever expected. Soviet and German forces locked in violent engagements only a few miles inland, while British troops, still preparing for their scheduled landings, scramble to understand how their supposed ally has arrived first. The surprise Soviet advance toward Cannes, driven by elements of the 5th Guards Army and Baltic Fleet Marines, creates a tactical picture without precedent in the war. And for the British 3rd Infantry Division, under Major General Tom Rennie, the sudden presence of Soviet troops turns one of the most carefully planned operations in military history into a race against time. The struggle begins with confusion. At 6:30, British landing craft approach Sword Beach and find Soviet positions, improvised and hastily entrenched, already under fire from German artillery. Soviet Marines signal frantically, using hand motions and torn pieces of red cloth, for the British to push inland quickly. Yet the British, forced into a landing zone narrower than expected, must first fight through stubborn German resistance. A corporal of the 2nd Battalion, East Yorkshire Regiment later writes, "The Russians were waving us forward, but we didn't even know where their lines ended or where the German guns were." The Soviet presence, instead of easing the assault, complicates every decision. By mid-morning, elements of the British 185th Brigade attempt to coordinate with what appears to be a Soviet forward command post near Colleville. The meeting lasts less than 5 minutes. British officers request a shared map. Soviet officers refuse. British staff ask about Soviet objectives. The Soviet colonel responds only that his orders are to reach Cannes before sunset. A British liaison later describes the moment. "We were fighting the same enemy, but not the same war." Operational diaries offer insight into why. Soviet High Command, particularly General Rokossovsky, has long feared that a delayed Allied landing would allow the Western powers to dominate the post-war landscape. A swift Soviet foothold in France would guarantee leverage in shaping the political boundaries of the liberated territories. But this ambition comes at a cost. Rapid Soviet movement inland stretches their supply lines thin and leaves their flanks exposed. With no established Allied air cover, German forces identify Soviet columns as priority targets. The German 21st Panzer Division, commanded by General Feuchtinger, exploits the disarray. At approximately 1400 hours, the division launches a counterattack toward the Orne River, striking directly at a Soviet Marine regiment attempting to regroup. The Germans, expecting to hit British units, are shocked to find Soviet infantry wielding PPSH-41s and Degtyaryov machine guns dug in along hedgerows unfamiliar to them. One German after-action report notes, "They attacked with ferocity, but they were alone. Their lines were too thin, their coordination non-existent." British commanders recognize the danger immediately. If the Soviet position collapses, German armor could roll straight toward the beaches before the British can establish a proper perimeter. Major General Rennie activates a contingency plan, dispatching No. 4 Commando and elements of the 13th/18th Royal Hussars inland to stabilize the sector. But as these units advance, something unusual begins to surface. Reports of missing reconnaissance teams. At least 3 British patrols, sent to make contact with Soviet forces north of the Orne, fail to return. Their final radio transmissions are brief and inconclusive. Distant machine gun fire, references to unfamiliar uniforms, and one fragment mentioning unidentified positions near a crossroads south of Salonelles. Whether these teams were ambushed by German units, caught in Soviet crossfire, or misidentified in the chaos remains unclear. But their disappearance becomes the first of several incidents that cloud the Allied-Soviet relationship on the developing front. Further complicating matters, intercepted Soviet radio traffic reveals deliberate withholding of information. A decrypted message, catalogued in a Bletchley Park logbook, indicates Soviet commanders have located German documents of political significance, believed to include intelligence on French resistance networks and German defensive plans. Yet the Soviets do not share any details with British intelligence, prompting quiet alarm in the war rooms of London. By evening on June 7, the British 3rd Infantry Division finally establishes a tenuous link with the Soviet spearhead outside Bénouville. The scene is one of exhaustion and mistrust. British officers observe Soviet soldiers digging shallow foxholes without proper tools, their uniforms soaked and tattered. Soviet officers, in turn, are wary of British caution, interpreting it as reluctance to advance. A British captain notes in his diary, "We were supposed to meet Americans. Instead, we found Russians demanding we push faster." Yet amid the friction, one fact becomes clear. The Germans are regrouping for a larger assault. Their reconnaissance units have identified the fractured nature of the Allied-Soviet alignment, and gaps in the front, sometimes less than a mile wide, threaten to become entry points for armored breakthroughs. The modern lesson emerges starkly. Coordination, not firepower, often determines the outcome of a crisis. Allies with misaligned goals can quickly become liabilities, even without direct conflict. Normandy, already a logistical puzzle, now becomes a geopolitical one. As night falls, the British secure key roadways, but their patrols report seeing Soviet units withdrawing from a critical crossroads without explanation. Why they abandoned the position remains unknown. It is the first of several unexplained movements that will shape the days to come, and will deepen the mystery surrounding the Soviet race for Cannes. The split Western Front has begun. Just after sunrise on June 8, 1944, a thin fog hangs over the Orne River Valley, an eerie calm that belies the chaos unfolding within it. In the confusion of the previous day's clashes, one fact grows unmistakably clear. The German 21st Panzer Division has seized the initiative. Its commander, General Feuchtinger, recognizing the disorganized Soviet advance and the delayed British link-up, orders a rapid counterstroke aimed at splitting the Soviet spearhead from the Allied beachhead. What follows is a day of violent engagements, missing patrols, and a growing mystery surrounding what exactly happened in the contested zone between Soviet and British lines. The struggle begins in earnest around 9:40, when elements of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment launch a coordinated attack against a Soviet Marine regiment positioned near the Orne Canal. These Soviet forces, largely from the 1st Baltic Marine Brigade, have dug in along narrow hedgerows, improvising defenses with overturned wagons and hastily placed Maxim machine guns. Despite their courage, they face a formidable enemy, Panzer IVs and self-propelled guns rolling through the mist. One Soviet survivor later recounts, "We had no tanks, no artillery. We had rifles and spirit. The Germans had everything else." British commandos from No. 4 Commando, advancing to reinforce the Soviet line, suddenly lose radio contact with their forward teams. The last message from Lieutenant Harold Kay's patrol is cryptic: "Movement ahead. Not German. Approaching crossroads. Will investigate." 12 hours later, not one member of Kay's patrol returns. Their disappearance marks the first confirmed vanishing of an entire British unit during this chaotic push inland. At the same time, the British 3rd Infantry Division attempts to establish a stable defensive corridor north of Bénouville. Major General Rennie orders his reconnaissance units to map the zone between the British and Soviet advance lines, a simple enough task made dangerous by the instability of the front. The recon teams report seeing Soviet units moving in irregular patterns, often without radio discipline. A sergeant from the Staffordshire Yeomanry notes, "Their movements made no sense. They shifted positions as if chasing something, or hiding something." Historical documents give these observations weight. Several Soviet dispatches recovered after the war mention the capture of materials of strategic and political nature from German positions. Soviet commanders appear determined to secure specific areas before British forces can reach them. This creates a dangerous overlap, one that leaves reconnaissance teams from both nations vulnerable to crossfire or misidentification. By midday, the German assault intensifies. Panzer grenadiers slip through a gap between Soviet and British lines, an unguarded orchard south of Salonels, and strike directly at a Soviet command post. The resulting firefight is brutal and close quarters. According to one German after-action account, the Russians fought like men trapped. They counterattacked with grenades in both hands. Yet despite their resilience, the Soviet command post collapses, and the Germans capture several maps and equipment crates later found abandoned in the woods. When British patrols finally reach the site hours later, they find no bodies, only scattered papers, destroyed radios, and the remnants of Soviet personal belongings. This absence becomes another layer of mystery. At 1600 hours, the British 13th/18th Royal Hussars attempt to break through to the Soviet-held sector but encounter contradictory instructions. A Soviet liaison officer insists they should proceed toward Cannes. A British artillery observer warns of German armor positioned along that same route. British command grows increasingly uneasy. Major General Rennie scribbles a terse note in his war diary. "We fight beside them, yet we do not understand them. Their silence is as troubling as the enemy's fire." As evening approaches, surviving Soviet units struggle to regroup. Their rapid inland push has overextended their lines, leaving them vulnerable and exhausted. Many have been fighting for nearly 36 hours with limited rations and no heavy equipment. The Soviets request ammunition and medical supplies from the British, but strained logistics and unclear intentions delay the response. In several cases, Soviet and British medics treat one another's wounded under mortar fire, testament to the shared danger despite the political tension hanging over the operation. Meanwhile, reconnaissance teams searching for the missing British commandos uncover puzzling signs. Abandoned gear that shows no bullet impacts, footprints indicating sudden movement toward the tree line, and empty shell casings from German and Soviet weapons, but none from the missing commandos. One investigator later remarks, "It was as if they walked into a fog and never came back out." Whether they were taken prisoner, mistakenly fired upon, or caught in a burst of crossfire remains unknown. By nightfall, the Orne River Valley is a patchwork of burning vehicles, shattered trees, and scattered bodies. Yet amid the devastation lies a deeper uncertainty. Who controls which sector? Where have the missing men gone? And why are the Soviets so intent on reaching Cannes ahead of the British, even at the cost of rash tactical decisions? The modern reflection is clear. In wartime, even allies operate with layers of secrecy and agendas unseen by one another. Cooperation is fragile, and the fog of war conceals more than enemy positions. It hides motives, intelligence, and truths that often remain buried. As darkness settles, a final report reaches British headquarters. Soviet troops have withdrawn from a fortified position near the Orne without explanation, leaving the area open to German infiltration. The unexplained withdrawal, combined with missing patrols and Soviet silence, leaves commanders uneasy. Something is unfolding behind the Soviet advance, something the British do not yet understand. And by morning, the consequences will become impossible to ignore. On June 9, 1944, the battered coastline of Normandy shudders under the weight of a new wave of war. At dawn, the first landing craft carrying elements of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, approach Omaha Beach. But this landing, unlike the one recorded in official history, faces a different battlefield. The unexpected Soviet presence, the chaotic inland fighting, and the German counterattacks triggered by the fractured front line have reshaped the enemy's defensive posture. German coastal batteries that, in the historical timeline, were partially disoriented by Allied deception now remain fully alert. Their guns, still intact and well-manned, scan the horizon for incoming craft. And they find them. The struggle begins immediately. As the ramps drop, American assault teams step into water thick with smoke from burning German positions, but also from Soviet supply trucks destroyed during overnight skirmishes further east. The Big Red One finds itself advancing into a battlefield already destabilized by an earlier, uncoordinated Soviet thrust. Their intelligence briefings, accurate only days earlier, fail to account for Soviet troop movements that have drawn German reserves toward the coastline rather than away from it. The men of the 16th Infantry Regiment face punishing fire. Beach obstacles, which the Allies historically suppressed with preparatory bombardment, remain largely untouched. Sergeant William C. Bayou recalls, "The guns sounded wrong. They were firing too quickly, too accurately. We'd been told the Germans would be disorganized. They weren't." His memory reflects a simple truth. The German 352nd Infantry Division, reinforced unexpectedly by units that had moved west in response to Soviet incursions, is fighting at near full strength. By late morning, American forces managed to secure a foothold on the beach, but their casualties are severe, far heavier than the planners in England anticipated. Meanwhile, reconnaissance units moving inland encounter anomalies that raise questions rather than provide clarity. One patrol from the 1st Recon Troop reaches the outskirts of Colleville only to report abandoned Soviet equipment. Empty ammunition crates, bloodied bandages, torn uniforms, but almost no bodies. The absence of the wounded puzzles the Americans. Were they evacuated? Captured? Or did Soviet units retreat deeper inland without informing their allies? British forces experience similar confusion. The 185th Brigade advances toward the Canned Bayou Road, expecting to link with Soviet units reportedly holding secure ground east of the Orne. Instead, they find Soviet positions hastily abandoned, trenches half-dug and supply caches partly destroyed. A British signals officer writes in his log, "It is clear they left in a hurry. As for why, no one will say." The unexplained withdrawal opens a corridor that German infantry quickly exploit, forcing the British to redirect resources to contain a threat that did not exist only hours earlier. Insight into Soviet decision-making remains elusive. Declassified fragments of Soviet communications intercepted by the Allies suggest commanders may have discovered sensitive German intelligence within a farmhouse east of Hera-Vallette. The intelligence, though its exact nature remains unknown, may be tied to Soviet fears of Western intentions after the war. One line from a decrypted message reads simply, "Information must not fall into foreign hands." It is unclear whether this refers to the British, the Americans, or both. By midday, the Germans reinforced their central sector with armored units from Panzer Lehr Division, historically delayed by Allied air superiority. But in this fractured alternative scenario, with American aircraft still struggling to establish air corridors, Panzer Lehr arrives earlier and hits harder. Their tanks strike at the seams between American, British, and Soviet lines. Fault lines widened by miscommunication and diverging objectives. The Western Allies, fighting to coordinate under fire, transmit urgent requests for artillery support, while Soviet commanders operate on a separate, more rigid order structure. The reveal comes in small pieces. A captured German officer mentions interrogating Soviet prisoners who claimed they were seeking documents, not positions. A British radio operator intercepts confused Soviet transmissions referencing primary files and priority targets, unrelated to tactical operations. None of the pieces fit neatly together, but each raises the same uneasy question. What exactly were the Soviets looking for? In one of the most unsettling discoveries of the day, a British patrol uncovers a burned-out supply convoy meant for the British 3rd Infantry Division. The convoy had vanished the previous evening. The trucks are riddled with small arms fire, and several crates are missing. Not a single driver or escort is found. The missing men join a growing list of disappeared personnel. British commandos, reconnaissance teams, Soviet Marines, vanishing in sectors where Germans are known to operate, but where the evidence offers no clear signs of flight, capture, or execution. The modern reflection becomes stark. Even in alliances built on mutual necessity, trust cannot be assumed. Tactical misalignment, political ambition, and withheld intelligence can fracture cooperation as surely as enemy fire. And when competing powers pursue different objectives on the same battlefield, the fog of war becomes more than a metaphor. It becomes a veil that obscures actions, motives, and truths. As evening settles over Normandy, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division digs into its newly secured positions. Smoke rises from the distant tree line. Gunfire echoes intermittently from the Cannes Road. And somewhere east of the Orne, Soviet units move again, under cover of darkness, avoiding Allied patrols, advancing not toward German armor but toward an objective still unclear to their Western counterparts. By morning, the fractured front will grow wider, and the mystery of the missing patrols, and missing documents, will deepen. By June 20, 1944, the fractured Norman countryside no longer resembles a single coordinated Allied invasion. It resembles two separate offensives unfolding side by side. To the east, Soviet forces push aggressively toward Cannes and Falaise, following orders that seem to prioritize speed over stability. To the west, Anglo-American forces consolidate their beachheads and advance inland with deliberate caution, struggling to secure supply lines that grow more vulnerable by the day. This division, physical, strategic, and political, creates a battlefield unlike any other in the war, a split Western Front. The day begins with the discovery of a mystery that rattles British command. A supply convoy scheduled to deliver ammunition and rations to the British 3rd Infantry Division has vanished somewhere along the Cannes-Colleville Road. Radio checks report the convoy on schedule at dusk the night before, but when dawn arrives, the entire column has disappeared. 5 Bedford trucks, 2 Bren carriers, and 16 men. No distress call was sent. No wreckage is initially found. Only silence. The struggle to maintain operational tempo without the convoy becomes immediate. Units already stretched thin must ration ammunition, postponing an advance planned for the afternoon. A captain in the Royal Army Service Corps writes, "It wasn't just the loss of supplies. It was the uncertainty. Men don't vanish in this country without some trace." But as the morning unfolds, the Allies discover a trace, one that deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Just after 10 o'clock, a reconnaissance patrol from the 13th/18th Royal Hussars finds 2 of the missing trucks in a ravine near a small wood south of Esquiville. Both vehicles are burned out, their metal twisted and blackened, but with a curious detail. The fire appears to have been controlled, almost deliberate, as if started to destroy cargo without destroying the surrounding foliage. Nearby, a 3rd truck lies abandoned but intact. Its contents, medical supplies and small arms ammunition, are gone. There are no footprints indicating a firefight, no shell casings, no visible struggle. And most unsettling of all, there are no bodies. Insight comes from an unlikely source, a decrypted fragment intercepted by Bletchley Park, describing Soviet units operating near the same sector the previous night. The message refers to retrieving sensitive materials, and instructs a Soviet officer to avoid Allied observation. Whether these materials came from the convoy or from German sources remains unclear. But the timing, proximity, and secrecy ignite a wave of speculation in British headquarters. Meanwhile, the tactical situation deteriorates. The split offensives begin forming physical gaps across the front line, sometimes small, sometimes dangerously wide. While the 1st U.S. Infantry Division advances carefully through the bocage towards St. Lo, Soviet infantry near Traun push forward aggressively without waiting for reinforcements. Their advance carves out a salient that is tactically impressive but strategically vulnerable. German commanders, quick to recognize the gap between Soviet and Allied sectors, funnel reinforcements into the open corridor. German infantry from the 346th Infantry Division exploit the weakness, slipping behind Soviet forward elements and launching harassing attacks on Soviet supply wagons and outposts. Several Soviet platoons are isolated or forced to retreat. A Soviet after-action note states, "The British were to hold the Western Road. They did not arrive. We were left exposed." British commanders counter that they were never informed of the Soviet intention to advance beyond designated lines. This lack of coordination becomes a defining feature of the day. American field commanders report instances of Soviet troops withdrawing unexpectedly from key crossroads, leaving them exposed to German infiltration. British artillery officers complain that Soviet units continue to transmit inaccurate grid coordinates, making cooperative fire missions nearly impossible. One RAF forward air controller remarks, "They behave as though it is their battle alone." The reveal comes in a chilling form that afternoon. A second group of burned vehicles is discovered deep in a wooded sector the Soviets had briefly occupied 2 days earlier. These vehicles are not British. They are German. But inside one charred half-track, Allied patrols find scraps of intelligence documents partially shielded from the fire. A fragment lists interrogation reports from captured resistance operatives. Another contains sketches of possible Soviet spy networks in Western Europe. Whether the Soviets destroyed these documents, or sought to obtain them, is a question that remains open. Even more perplexing, British engineers inspecting the site identify tire tracks matching those of Soviet ZIS-5 trucks. The Soviets deny involvement. But the combination of missing British drivers, burned German intelligence materials, and Soviet truck tracks intensifies Allied suspicion. The modern reflection emerges naturally. Wartime alliances are complex, built on shifting priorities, competing intelligence goals, and political strategy as much as military necessity. In the fog of war, even allies may act independently, creating confusion that echoes long after the shooting stops. As evening sets in, the split Western Front takes its full shape. Soviet commanders push deeper toward Falaise, determined to secure a breakthrough before Allied forces can close the gap. The Americans and British strengthen their own sectors, wary of overextending into Soviet zones. Commanders exchange strained radio messages that carry more tension than cooperation. And somewhere between Esquivel and Traun, the missing 16 men of the British supply convoy remain unaccounted for, swallowed by a battlefield where the enemy is known, but the actions of Allies grow increasingly difficult to interpret. With each day, the divide widens. By early July 1944, the Normandy campaign has split into two distinct, uneasy fronts. One British-American, methodically grinding through the bocage towards Saint-Lô and Bayeux, and one Soviet, lunging with relentless speed toward Cannes and the Falaise corridor. What was meant to be the decisive Allied landing in Western Europe has instead become a geopolitical contest, a race for influence hidden within the same battlefield. And across this fractured landscape, the unresolved disappearances, British, American, and Soviet alike, hang over every command meeting, every patrol, every advance. Something is unfolding behind the Soviet push westward, and the Western Allies still do not know what it is. The final act begins with a hook recorded in the diary of a U.S. Army intelligence captain. "We share a front, but not a mission." His entry was dated July 2nd, written after a briefing where American officers learned that Soviet troops had advanced nearly 2 miles beyond their assigned sector, again, without coordination. The Soviets now hold pockets of territory west of Cannes that put them in direct competition with British objectives. But the deeper concern lies with reports from the field, intercepted Soviet transmissions referencing priority archives, night movements without headlights, and repeated avoidance of joint patrols. The struggle intensifies on July 4th, when British units of the 3rd Infantry Division attempt a long-planned assault toward Emyville, only to find that the Soviets have already seized the town during a nighttime operation. Their presence is not the issue, their secrecy is. British observers note that Soviet units immediately seal off several buildings, including the mairie and a railway office, refusing entry even to British engineers checking for mines. A Soviet lieutenant brusquely tells them, "This area is of importance to Moscow," and demands they move on. The British comply but submit a report that reaches General Miles Dempsey himself. The tone of his margin notes is unmistakably troubled. Insight emerges when American photo reconnaissance flights capture images of Soviet trucks transporting crates marked with German military insignia, crates loaded from a farmhouse east of Emyville. Analysts suspect these contain intelligence materials, resistance files, interrogation summaries, or lists of Soviet agents tracked by the Gestapo. If true, the Soviets may be conducting a parallel mission, recovering documents that could shape post-war Europe. Yet no Allied commander can confirm this. The Soviets share no details. Their silence is near total. Meanwhile, the disappearances continue. On July 6th, a platoon from the U.S. 4th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron reports finding a field aid station hastily abandoned, with bloodied Soviet bandages lying on stretchers but no bodies, alive or dead. Nearby, they discover German shell casings scattered among Soviet ones, but again, no signs of the wounded. An infantry sergeant writes in confusion, "It's as if they walked away mid-operation." The same afternoon, British sappers uncover a shallow pit containing burned paper fragments in Cyrillic and German, mixed together, possibly intelligence documents that someone wanted erased. Then comes the reveal that reframes the entire mystery. On July 9, a British liaison officer stationed near Traun intercepts a Soviet field message intended for an adjacent regiment. The document is poorly encoded and easily deciphered. Its contents are stark: secure the files. Avoid Western units. Exfiltrate East if necessary. Moscow priority overrides all. While it does not mention missing British or American troops, it raises a chilling possibility. Soviet forces may have been avoiding, and perhaps even detaining, Allied personnel who stumbled into zones where these sensitive operations were underway. And yet, the truth remains obscured. No prisoners are ever recovered. No formal accusation is made. The war provides too much chaos, too many bodies, too many shifting lines to trace precise responsibility. The missing men, British commandos, Soviet Marines, American scouts, become casualties of a fog thicker than gun smoke, the fog of conflicting political objectives. As the Soviets surge toward Falaise, British and American planners quietly debate how far to advance into Soviet-held territory. A memorandum drafted at the headquarters of General Omar Bradley includes the line, "We must avoid direct confrontation, but we cannot allow an uncontrolled Soviet thrust to define the Western theater." The Allied High Command wants to win the war, but they also want to shape the peace that follows. And now, for the first time, they fear their ally might be trying to outrun them in both. The modern reflection is sobering. Even at the height of shared sacrifice, alliances bend under pressure. Intelligence, leverage, and future borders matter as much as battlefield victory. In Normandy, the seeds of the Cold War could have sprouted weeks before Paris was even liberated. By July 12, the Soviets and Western allies finally stabilized their lines, but the tension remains palpable. Their offensives proceed on parallel tracks, close enough to see each other's smoke yet distant in purpose. The Soviets tighten control around Cannes. The British and Americans brace for the breakout toward Avranches. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when patrols whisper along the hedgerows, one lingering question remains unspoken. What exactly did the Soviets find in the fields and villages of Normandy? Documents, intelligence, or secrets worth risking Allied goodwill? And what happened to the men who stumbled upon them? The answers are never fully uncovered. They fade into the archives of wartime secrecy, lost in the shadows of a split Western front that never fully healed.